So, you want to get into drifting. You saw some Instagram video or you went to a drift event and you said,
I want to be cool and rebellious like these people.
well, what car do you get? Today we're going to go over the top 10 best starter drift cars. Break out those wallets and sell a kidney because drifting takes more money from you than drugs. And the car is just the start. I'm your host, Ricky Skids, and this is Skidded Media. So what are our conditions for a drift car? 1, needs to be rear-wheel drive. 2, front engine. 3, and a manual transmission. Now on top of that, it needs to be somewhat reliable and there needs to be readily accessible aftermarket mods you can buy, as well as OEM parts for repair. Part of having a drift car is modding it, driving it, breaking it, and fixing it. So having a one-off chassis with weird custom parts often isn't the best, because then you'll likely spend more time and money fixing it and trying to get it to work than actually driving it. So we need to find a chassis that lends themselves well to drifting and has plentiful aftermarket support to make drifting feasible. We're going to try to keep it on the cheaper end and stay under $10,000. There are of course really good legendary chassis that cost more than that, and some of these in this list are legends as well, and amazing lifelong drift cars, not just starter drift cars. We'll start at 10 and work our way down to the number 1 best starter drift car, and we'll go over the pros and cons of each. Starting off with number 10, the Mustang GT. Okay, I know what some of you might be thinking.
Mustangs shouldn't be on this list.
And normally I would agree with you, but hear me out. In a purely practical sense, they make sense. But drifting doesn't make sense. Now, with a $10,000 budget, you can get anything from a Fox body, an early SN95, a late SN95, or maybe if you find a good deal, you can find an early S197. Now, here are the pros and cons. Pros, they are cheap. They have good power. For the most part, they're pretty reliable. They have readily accessible parts at any parts store, and they have a huge aftermarket support. The cons would be they lack style. Now, they don't lend themselves to the style of drifting very well. Yes, they can be styled up, but it takes a little bit more creativity, and even with that, in respect to the drifting culture, they don't even come close to a styled up S chassis. The second con, and some of you may know this, is they have a live rear axle, or known as the solid rear axle. Some models like the SN95 Cobra had independent rear suspension, but the Mustangs in general, from the base model to the GT500, did not receive independent rear suspension until 2015. Ford did this for cost savings, but if any one of you know, a solid rear axle for motorsports purposes usually lacks performance other than drag racing, and that's because essentially one side is affected by the other. If the right rear hits a bump, then the left rear is affected by this and can cause unpredictable suspension performance. To put this in perspective, why this is such a big deal, the Nissan Z has had independent rear suspension since its inception in 1969, meaning Ford was behind the curve for almost 46 years compared to Nissan. Number 9, the C5 Corvette. Now, this is definitely on the higher end of the budget, and to make it into the $10,000 budget, you're gonna have to really dig deep and find a really good deal, and it's also probably going to have higher mileage. But in the past 5 to 10 years, Corvettes have really shined in drifting. The chassis is perfect for drifting and really any motorsport. In fact, I remember a few years ago when Taylor Ray got his C5 and put some coilovers on it, had some custom knuckles made for it, a custom handbrake, and put some work VSKFs, and it was ready to go, which opened my eyes to how easy it was to make them into drift cars. Nowadays, we have proper aftermarket support for them in regards to drifting. Now, here are some of the pros and cons. Pros: great chassis, reliable LS1 engine, tons of aftermarket mods, and OEM parts availability. Cons: the transaxle. Now, some people may not see this as a big deal, but it definitely is unique to the C5, the C6, and the C7 Corvette. transaxle design in the Corvette works like this. The engine is in the front. Instead of the transmission behind the engine, it's moved to the back near the rear wheels. Now, the engine and transmission are connected by a long, solid tube called the torque tube. This setup spreads the weight more evenly between the front and the rear of the car, but adds complexity. So when it comes to repairing and or modifying anything that involves the transaxle, it's going to be more expensive and more time consuming. The other con to the C5, just like the Mustang, is style. Since Corvettes are mainly owned by old white guys that have never gone over 80 miles an hour in them, who think their Millennium Yellow C5 Corvette that was made on a Thursday at 2:51 p.m. is special, they inherently lack aftermarket styling support. Now, you can get creative and use some JDM inspired styling and possibly try to retrofit some FD-RX-7 body pieces and JDM wheels to make them look better, but Gramps might have a heart attack if he sees it. Number 8. The G35 with manual. Now, I'm not a huge fan of these, and it's not the car's fault. In regards to the chassis, they're pretty decent, but it's really the people that own them. It's hard to describe, but if you know, you know. Other than that, it's pretty much a 350Z. And if you get a sedan, it's a 4-door 350Z. Pros: good chassis and drivetrain, huge aftermarket support, OEM parts availability, and somewhat reliable. Cons: owned and beat to shit by Edgar's, eats engine oil, not the best cooling system, but just watch your temps to avoid overheating, and they don't have the best styling compared to some other cars. Number 7. The MX-5 Miata. Now, I love Miatas, but not for drifting, and I know what you're asking.
Why do you have it on the list?
I'll explain in a second. Whether it's an NA, NB, or NC Miata, they are great, cheap toge or time attack cars, and you'll see them used in drifting, but only because it has the basics we talked about earlier: front engine, rear wheel drive, and a manual. And yes, they can go sideways. Is it good at going sideways? Kind of. See, they have a short wheelbase, which is great for grippy situations, but for drifting, short wheelbases can lead to a lack of angle and are more prone to snap oversteer and can feel a little bit more twitchy and can't hold a consistent drift compared to longer wheelbase cars. Not to say you're not going to have fun with it while you're going somewhere sideways, but if you're looking for more of a long-term drift build, this may not be the best choice. Pros: they are cheap, they have a lot of aftermarket support mechanically and style-wise, they're pretty reliable, and they have a lot of OEM parts availability. Cons: short wheelbase, and they're kind of slow. Number 6, the BMW E46 and E36. If American or Japanese is not your style, well, let's find something a little less reliable, but pretty cheap. Now, I know this is technically two different cars, but they're very similar and very different at the same time. Now, the Germans make an excellent driver's car, and the E46 and E36 falls in line. In fact, pretty much all of the 3 Series BMWs of any generation are known for their balance and handling. As long as it's not an M3, it can be had for not that much money, although an M3 drift car would be pretty sick tight. The great thing about an E46 or E36, or really any front engine manual rear-wheel drive BMW, is not only are they very good at most motorsports, they're very good at drifting and are amazing chassis. But they do have their downfalls, and part of the downfall is if you happen to treat German cars in a way the engineers did not intend, or just drive the car over 100,000 miles, you may or may not have a running and driving car anymore. See, the E46 especially was known for cooling issues, vanish issues, and electrical issues. And the E36 has similar issues, but just a little bit less. But they drive great when they do drive. Now, of course, a lot of these issues can be solved with aftermarket solutions, or just swap in a Japanese or American drivetrain to solve it all, like some people do. Now, if you want a better looking or a little less fat BMW, then look no further than the E46 predecessor, the E36. The E36 has a mid to late 90s beauty to it, and I would argue is slightly more reliable than the E46 because it's a little bit simpler and made in a time where you kinda got what you paid for in terms of quality. They are lighter, more nimble, and are amazing driver's cars and are well known in the drifting community, but they do have their reliability issues just like any other BMW, just a slight hair less than its successor. Pros: great chassis, great aftermarket support, and they look good. Cons: it can be unreliable because BMW. Number 5, an IS300 with a manual. Here is one of my personal favorites, and I also own it. You can't see it, but it's back there. Now, factory manual options for these cars are more rare, but manual swaps are common. Now, this car has an amazing chassis, and its cousins, the JZX90, the JZX100, the JZX110, the JZS151, the JZS161, and the JZS171, meaning they share a lot of parts, suspension geometry, and in some cases are mechanically interchangeable for some things, as well as some trim specs. The JZXs and JZSs had the legendary 1JZ GTE and the Aristo with the 2JZ GTE. So when it comes to engine swaps, it's a little easier to swap them into the IS300. To give you an idea of how great this car is, the same guy who helped engineer the legendary AE86, Nobuaki Katayama, was also the chief engineer for the Altezza. His intent was to make a sporty driver-focused car. Now you might ask,
The Altezza?
yes, the IS300 is known as the Altezza in Japan and was actually created for the Japanese market first in 1998 and then came to the States in 2001 as the IS300 with the 2JZ GE. Now, because people have figured out these cars are amazing, they are definitely more expensive than they used to be. Pro: they're a great chassis, they're reliable, great style potential, great OEM parts availability, and amazing aftermarket support. Cons: they're expensive, can be hard to find in the factory manual, and sometimes an Edgar gets a hold of one of them and beats the shit out of it. Number 4, the FRS BRZ 86 ZN6. This chassis may be slow, but who cares? Slow cars make the best drivers, and these were designed on purpose to be slow. But what we really are interested in is the chassis. This car is practically a modern day S chassis and can be had for under $10,000 easily for the early year cars. Now, what do I mean by modern day S chassis? Well, the chassis and suspension are very similar. For example, in the front suspension of the ZN6, it has a McPherson strut style setup like the S chassis. The weight is almost the same. In fact, the base manual transmission trims of the ZN6 weighs 50 pounds less than the base manual S14. And that lightness equates to better performance and handling. Now, a couple of things that hold them back is that they have electric power steering, which for some is not a big deal and actually can be a good thing. And for others, it's a negative because you get less feedback in the steering wheel. For drifting, this doesn't matter as much as it does in grip driving, but the sole engineering intent was to reduce weight. Now, just like any other car, they do have their little issues, but they're pretty reliable as long as they're taken care of. The F820 engine is known for some oil consumption, but as long as you're on top of the oil changes and check your oil after some hard driving, you should be fine. These cars also have a huge aftermarket support. In fact, a lot of gnarly builds have JZs, LSs, and K series swapped into them. I think I would go with a K swap to keep that lightweight, balanced feel. They are truly a modern day S chassis. Pros: great chassis, great aftermarket support, OEM parts availability, lightweight, balanced, and cheap. Cons: they're slowish, and depending on how you look at it, the electric power steering can be a con. I want you to stay. Number 3, the Nissan 240SX S14. Now we're getting into the top 3, and we have the S14. The S14 is one of the known legends of the 90s for drifting, and you can get it into different front end styles, the Kooky and or the Zenki. I love both of them, but I think me personally, I would go for the Kooky. Now, S chassis in general are amazing driver's cars that give you so much feedback and are simple and have gobs of aftermarket support. There is a reason why they are legendary, and you'll see all different types of engine swaps in these. And in Japan, they are known as the Sylvia and got the choice of the SR20 DET. And we only got the KA24. The SR makes way more power and has way more tuning potential. So here in the States, the KA often gets replaced by either an SR, a JZ, LS, or an RB. S14s are getting harder to find and more expensive, but you can still find one under 10,000 if you search real hard for it. Pros: they're great chassis, huge aftermarket support, are legends, and have amazing style potential. Cons: they're getting hard to find and are expensive, OEM parts availability, and they're kind of slow with the KA. In fact, they're really slow with the KA. Number 2, the Nissan 240SX S13. So you think the S14 is getting hard to find? Well, let me introduce the S13. This has all the goodies of the S14, but it's just cooler in my opinion. It has that early 90s, late 80s aura, and when one is done properly, it's jaw-droppingly amazing. Again, these are amazing driver's cars because they're light, raw, balanced, proportioned, and good in every way. They have unbelievable aftermarket support and are one of the ultimate legends that drove side by side with the 886 in the mountains of Japan, building the roots of drifting. And they are so good that they are still relevant today in drifting almost 35 years later. Now again, in the States, we only got the KA and no SR. So it's quite common for people to swap the engine and the drivetrain in these. And yes, you can find them still under 10,000, but a lot of them are beat up and abused, and people still want loads of money. And it's getting very hard to find one that's not. Also, finding OEM parts is getting difficult as well. You have a better chance of finding $1 million in a suitcase than an uncracked OEM S13 dash. Pros: they're great chassis. They have huge aftermarket support, are legends, and have amazing style potential. Cons: they're getting hard to find and expensive, the OEM parts availability, and they're slow, just like the S14. Now to the number 1 best starter drift car, the Nissan 350Z. Now, this may come as a shock for some of you, and to be honest, this would not be my personal pick of cars I would get on this list.
So why is it on here?
Well, we have to think practically as well. The S13 and the S14 are amazing, but they're not super practical. And for someone that's just starting to get into drift cars, or may not have a lot of mechanical experience, and or doesn't want to basically rebuild a 35-year-old car and just want something that's reliable and easy, this may be the answer. See, the 350Z fills in the gaps for where all the rest of these cars couldn't fill in for less than 10,000. They are abundant, they're cheap, they can be styled up, they're new enough to where you can get parts at any parts store. They have more than enough power to drift. They are relatively easy to work on. They have plentiful aftermarket parts. They are somewhat reliable. And besides that, they are driver's cars. They have the same lightweight, balanced feel of an S chassis and the ZN6 chassis. And in fact, 350Z is really part of the Z family tree that started way back in 1969 with the 240Z. They're balanced, lightweight in comparison to the other cars in this category, and for $10,000 or less, You can't find a better choice that has all of these things, which is also its downside. See, the bad part about these cars, similar to the G35 and the Mustang, is that people see that, and some of the owners are not actually car enthusiasts. Rather, they are people that want a sporty car for cheap, whether it be teenagers or Edgars. Now, you can find clean, unmolested versions that maybe grandpa or grandma got for the retirement fun car. Because to grandpa and grandma, it was the modern version of that 1969 240Z that they dreamed about owning when they were younger. Now, just like any other car, they do have their issues. This stems from their engine, the VQ35, which is known for oil consumption, timing chain rattle, and their cooling system. But they can be reliable if maintenance and taken care of. In the later model 350Z, you get the VQ35HR, which has a little bit more power and is slightly more reliable. They also slightly resemble a turtle from the side view. But here's the thing I'm trying to get at. They have the horsepower that none of these cars have on this list other than the Corvette and the Mustang. They have the styling potential that some of these cars have, but others fall short. They have the reliability that BMWs can't come close to. They have the aftermarket support just like an S chassis. It's almost as if all of these cars on this list came together and the 350Z was the result. Also, the Drift King and Tokyo Drift drove it. Pros: they're a great chassis, good drivetrain, they're cheap, have huge aftermarket support, can have good style potential, and are somewhat reliable. Cons: they are often driven around by Edgars and are beat to shit. They eat engine oil. Not the best cooling system, just watch your temps to avoid overheating. So there you go. The top 10 best starter drift cars under $10,000. Now, like I said before, these cars are not only good starter cars, but good cars in general for drifting. Some of these choices are solid lifetime drift cars. Let me know what you guys think of the list, or if I missed anything, or if there's any cars you think should be added. And if you enjoyed this video and are passionate about car culture, help the Skidded Media community grow by subscribing and sharing this with your friends. Thank you again, and stay sick tight.